read your book first just before it came out, and I like the term developmental politics. And I want to ask about the term post-progressive, because in chapter 3, you do a great job of laying out what postmodern means. But I'm curious if people, especially people who may not be familiar with spiral dynamics or integral theory, if you have found that people confuse, because I did at first, postmodernism with being post-progressive, because as I understand it, post-progressive sort of kicks off postmodern values. So how's that term working out for you, post-progressive?
Sure, excellent question. So when I first encountered this philosophy, it was largely dominated by color jargon. First, the spiral dynamics colors, and then Ken Wilber came with his own version of colors. And within, this sort of inside discourse, everybody talked about it in colors, which were sticky. But the folks from the outside, they thought this is some kind of weird, jargony, cultish thing that I don't want to spend my time learning this color jargon. And so in terms of my goal of helping integral philosophy to flourish, helping this perspective to do work in the world, right, by helping the culture evolve and grow, one of my first aims was to try to come up with names that would be descriptive. That as people started talking about them, even people who were not familiar that much with the discourse would have would get an inkling of what we're talking about, right? And these weren't. So I chose the term, traditionalism, modernism, or modernity, and what we at first called postmodernism, right? So these were sort of the terms that I used to label these worldviews that we're going to talk about in my 2007 book, Integral Consciousness. And so I wanted to choose a term for the next emerging stage, beyond the progressive worldview. We've since, the culture sort of caught up with us. At the time, progressivism, in 2007, progressivism was just sort of this generalized term that applied to anybody who was left of the center in general. But the media has, in response to the polarity within the left, the polarity between what they call moderates and those who are more left, they're now called progressives. So there's been a sort of an evolution of terminology, at least in the media, whereby that's a term that people know what you're talking about, right? They can think of, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders when they think about what progressive means. So even in developmental politics, I still use the term postmodern, but my colleagues and I realized that the better term, because postmodern as a term, it's a battleground of meaning, right? Most people, when you say postmodern, they think you're talking about the post-structuralist, critical academic philosophers. And what we're trying to describe is a much larger cultural worldview that includes lots of different elements and ideologies, certainly including critical theory, but not limited to it. So this battle to work out the terms is something that's ongoing. So we've settled on the terms, and we'll be using those in this course, of traditionalism, modernity or modernism, and progressivism as these three main worldviews that we're trying to integrate. And tonight I'll mention this idea of the pre-traditional, which is this sort of older worldview, and it's even controversial to talk about that, but it's a worldview that in my 2007 book, I called it Warrior Consciousness and Culture, to try to emphasize the dignity of it. In developmental psychology, it's called egocentric consciousness, and that was just too much of a diss. I want to honor every stage. So in trying to come up with this label, a sticky label that'll apply to what we're talking about, but also be provocative in its own way, being just mildly polemical in a way that it does a rhetorical job of getting people's attention. There's lots of different terms that are vying for this label right now. Integral has been the term, but if you Google integral, it doesn't look good. And I also think that that it's associated specifically with Ken Wilber, and while I honor Wilber and do my best to stand on his shoulders, I'm personally not a Wilberian, and we've had a lot of people say that we don't like the term integral. There's too much baggage. So I think we're going to, for now, have a bunch of different synonyms for this. Certainly, integral is.
You're not finding that people get confused between postmodern and post-progressive.
Every term.
And progressive is pretty much, you're equating that with what we used to call postmodern. Is that right?
I'd say every term has an element of confusion, or there's good and bad of each. So I'm not using this term post-progressive as exclusive, but I think it does good work descriptively by suggesting that there is a developmental trajectory, and that progressivism is the most recent major large-scale worldview to emerge, but something comes after it. Maybe something even higher or more inclusive than progressivism. But it also, some people might take it as a diss, like we're somehow over progressivism, and that's not our intention. As soon as we use the term post-progressive, we say post-progressivism is not anti-progressivism. That's another segment of the culture. But there's also terms competing for it, like metamodernism is another term that some people are trying to gain traction with. The term that I used in developmental politics is extremely inelegant and won't work as a label, but it did describe what it was about, and that is postmodern. People love that one. Anyway, post-progressive just is meant to suggest that there's a developmental trajectory and that progressivism is not the end of history. So whether this term will work or not, we've been debating it quite a bit. We'll explain what it means more. There's definitely a potential for confusion, but that's the case with any defined term which you're introducing and that's new.